I know you guys are up to good things. Got it. And as an almost as an accident, when I started doing this series, people started asking me to come out and talk about the stories that I'm doing. It's not my story. These are your stories. These are people like you out there all across Canada who are really making a difference. And so I've been able to do about 150 talks in the last 5 years across Western Canada. And I have to say, I'm enjoying that as much or even more than what I do, because it's so great to get feedback and to go into rooms like in Drayton Valley, Alberta, where, you know, if you pay attention to the memes on Facebook, you'd think they're a bunch of grumpy old oil people who hate everything green. Not true. When you're on the ground and you go and you speak to the people on the ground, whether it's in Red Deer or Drayton Valley or Fort McMurray or Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia, they're all following this stuff and they're interested in this stuff. So let's get started with no further ado. Just got to get the right clicking thing working here. So my highest level message is energy transition is here. It's not something in the future anymore. And you know, when I started this series, there was almost no solar in Alberta. That's how much things have changed. And as you'll see as when we go through this, wow, things have changed so much. It really makes your head spin. And so what I'm going to talk about is where investment's going, what's happening in the world. And I'm going to zero in on solar today because that's what I was told you guys are interested in focusing on. And it's one of the areas I read in your planning document that I can actually tie into. I love this first slide because it suggests the opportunities that are out there. And there's the really big opportunities right now, both economically and to solve climate change, are in clean energy, zero emissions transportation, green buildings, and smart technologies. The woman on the left there, she's part of the new generation, a young person from Ontario who graduated, it's probably 8 or 9 years ago now, but what she wanted to go into journalism. And, you know, at that time, that would have been a patently stupid idea because newspapers are busy closing, media outlets are closing. It's basically a dying industry. It's not dying because people like me have taken over in our tiny little niches all over the place. And that's the cool part. But what she did is she focused as well. She zeroed in on a topic. Her topic was climate change. She wound up at a very young age working for Climate Wire, covering climate change in Washington, D.C., went on to be one of the leading correspondents for Green Tech Media, which was the leading green tech media organization in the world while it was operating. And now she's working for a huge finance company financing green initiatives that help climate change. So, you know, there's lots of young folks who get it. And you know, I think we need to start pointing to them instead of pointing to the ones that say, oh, shucks, you know, I might not have a job tomorrow. You can have a job tomorrow. You just have to change your thinking. So I'm going to start with good news. And that is, you know, that as I said, the energy transition is here and the times are changing in a really significant way. The guy on the right is one of my heroes. It's Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, and a leading proponent of moving investment towards green investments. He's really doing amazing work out there right now. The guy on the left is the CEO of one of Alberta's prominent coal companies, Capital Power, who produced most of their energy from coal for many years. Like TransAlta, like all the other companies. This quote that I have on the screen here is from an interview. It's not published yet. It's a series I'm producing for the city of Edmonton. But I just found this astounding, you know, at how much stuff has changed. He wouldn't have said this even 4 years ago or 5 years ago. But, you know, when I asked him about why we need to do this stuff, here's the CEO of now almost a former coal company, talking about climate change, his children, and how the reality of the challenge and the dangers are here today, not in 2050. And I just thought that just points to how much stuff has changed. He was very forthcoming about this stuff. His company now has a plan to get to net zero by 2050. Not an easy road, but you know, I just find that really exciting because he wouldn't even have touched on this 10 years ago. So let's start first with the high picture, the really high level 40,000 foot picture, and that is a clean energy investment. This slide, if I'd have shown you this slide 2 years ago, it would have said investment is, I forget what the number was. Does it say there in the slide? 13 trillion. So Bloomberg had come out with an analysis that said about, I think it was 2019, and they said of all the future investment in electricity generation in the world between now and 2050, 77% of that will be in renewable energy. I found that pretty astounding in 2019. The number they quoted was 13.3 trillion. Well, since then, Forbes, Mark Carney, many others have updated that. Now they're saying that number's over $100 trillion will be spent on renewable energy. So if you're trying to think about, what your kids should be studying as a trade or as a degree, you need to think about these things. As you're trying to lobby for fighting climate change and getting to solution, why not follow the money and advocate for the stuff that can be done and will be done, and where economics is on your side. The one thing I found very surprising about this slide, and this has changed in the last 4 or 5 years very significantly, and that is that solar has caught up with, and in some cases overtaken wind in terms of cost. And so as of now, they're projecting most of the renewable energy development between now and 2050 will transition to solar. Still a big role for wind, hydro, and some other stuff. But solar is really taking over, and that's because the economics have changed so radically in the last 5 years or so. Let's look at the other big piece of the pie. Clean energy, clean electricity is really important, very important. It's one of the big boxes. The second big box, of course, is transportation. In Edmonton, they say in the energy transition plan that transportation is about 1/3 of emissions. Well, this is shocking too, because 5 or 6 years ago, people were wondering, if we'd ever get EVs. Well, EVs are past tense. It's already past tense. I just heard a radio show today a few minutes ago talking about EVs coming and that sort of thing, but it's past tense. Virtually every single automaker in the world has transitioned their investment to EVs to the tune of, it's now 515 billion. And again, if I had given you this number 2 years ago, it was 300 billion. It's now 515 billion. And it's led by Volkswagen, which has itself over $100 billion worth of investment in EVs. And there's about somewhere between 400 and 700 models under development, most of which are due out before 2025. So that change is already coming. And it's because the supply is going to be almost exclusively EVs in a very short period of time. Green buildings is a really hard area to quantify in the same easy, compact way. But if you look at climate change, and the city of Edmonton, for example, says that buildings are, I think it's about 1/3 of emissions. Depending on how you slice the pie, it's 1/3 or less or more, depending on how you look at where emissions come from. But buildings are huge, and there's a really big challenge with buildings, and that is 80% of the buildings that will be standing by 2050 and emitting carbon are already built, and they were built inefficiently. So the big challenge, there's two big challenges. One, to get new homes to essentially net zero or near net zero. I think that's done. I think it's already coming. There's a national model building code that will shoot for net zero by 2030. The builders are starting to get on board. I think we're going to solve that part of it. The big part to solve is how do we do old buildings and take those emissions out, which are going to be much harder. I just throw this in just out of curiosity. I'm not going to go through it, but I took this out of a presentation from the International Renewable Energy Agency, and it's just like an opportunity map for solving climate change and for investment and for what to do about climate change. And so these are the big ticket areas. And again, it talks about the things I just mentioned: green transportation, green construction, green energy, and a bunch of other things. So there's quite an opportunity map. And the future economically is going to be so radically different, and it's coming so fast. Politicians definitely haven't wrapped their heads around this yet. And like I said, the investment has moved. So it's not that I have to go and convince these folks to invest in these things. It's already happening. I've just threw this in just for fun, and it just shows that renewable energy does produce jobs. And there are many different takes on this. I could show you graphs that show some sectors different than the sectors you see here. But the big story is there's lots of jobs in moving this stuff. The jobs aren't long-term because unlike oil and gas, for example, if you're going to produce electricity, or coal, let's say you're going to produce electricity, the jobs stay a long time because every day you have to drive trucks from a mine back to the power plant. Once you build a solar plant, it just sits there and produces energy, and it needs a couple of guys or women to run around and make sure everything's working and monitor the systems, fix the odd solar module, replace an inverter, but otherwise it just kind of sits there and produces energy because you don't have to mine anything. So that's not great for jobs in terms of operating these things, but it is great for us as consumers because it'll mean energy will be lower cost. So let's talk about energy as one of the big pies. This is a graph I just produced for a story I was working on. I actually have a really nice animated version of this. I can't show it in the slideshow because they're not very reliable on Zoom. But this is Alberta today. This was, I captured this, what was the date? I think it was sometime, I think it was February. And so this is the mix in Alberta today. It's gone from 81% coal, 81% coal in 1995, I think it was, to 8% coal now. And the only coal left in Alberta today, TransAlta's closed theirs, the other guys have closed theirs. The only coal left is Capital Power's Genesee Power Plant west of Edmonton. And it's already being renovated. All 3 units are being renovated, 2 to combined cycle gas, very efficient gas, and the other one to straight up gas. And that 8% will be gone by early next year, by sometime next year. So we've already transitioned in Alberta. The big question I'm not going to try to answer right now because it could take the rest of the talk is how do we take that blue slice and take the emissions out of that? That's the next big job. It's not as big a task as you might think. I'll just leave you with that. I wanted to mention one thing about emissions. People talk about where emissions come from, by sector, by sources of energy, there's so many different ways you can slice the pie. My point here is don't get all confused by all the different ways you see this sliced up. For example, in Edmonton, when they talk about their energy transition plan, they talk about emissions coming from industry, transportation, and buildings, a third, roughly. If you look at nationally, if you look at the right there, you can see it by sector. It's a different way of slicing the pie. And what's important to know is no matter how you slice the pie is the interrelationships. So look at the graph on the right there. And let's say we transform all of our cars to electric. Well, that transportation sector goes way down in terms of emissions. Electricity sector, it doesn't affect the electricity sector directly in terms of emissions, but it does double. Not by itself, but with all the other things we're doing, it'll double the amount of electricity we need. And it'll reduce the emissions from oil and gas dramatically because we're not fueling vehicles from that sector. So there's lots of interrelationships. It's important to keep that in mind. So moving to the topic du jour, which is my favorite topic too, by the way. Renewable energy is cheapest now, just about anywhere in the world. And Alberta actually proved that we can do renewable energy cheapest for solar and wind. It was the first place in Canada to actually commission large projects that were cheap. And once that broke the ice, things just came unglued, and Alberta's going a little bit crazy right now. It's ironic, you don't hear this in the news, but Alberta is experiencing a pretty massive solar and wind boom right now. There are so many projects under development. The largest solar project in Canadian history is the Claresholm project at 132 megawatts for about 440,000 solar modules. It's already operating. It started in February. It won't be the largest solar project in Canadian history for long because the Traverse project near Vulcan is due to start either later this year or I think it's next year, and it's 3.5 times that at 465 megawatts, about 2.5 million solar modules. And again, no one knows how cheap these can produce electricity. It could be as low on the production end as a penny a kilowatt hour. That's what we're talking about with, of course, we won't pay that. There's got to be profits in there and all kinds of other stuff. But you could see selling solar energy for 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's a really big deal. Alberta is the best place in all of Canada, and it's a total accident. It's not like we planned for this to happen, but it's because of the way we deregulated our electricity industry that we're now the best place in Canada to build these projects, and virtually all of the big stuff being built is being built here. This Traverse project, which is under construction, by the way, is being built by a tiny entrepreneur, a small entrepreneur, Greengate Power. It's a Calgary company. Guy used to sell software to the oil industry. His name's Dan Balaban. He was my fourth story 10 years ago that I did out of 300 stories. I called him a wind energy cowboy at that time. And he was kind of a cowboy because it was a crazy business 10 years ago to get into, because it was really hard to foresee how you would make money. And now look, 10 years later, he's built the largest wind project in Canadian history, now the largest solar project, and they're doing it with very good economic prospects. And in fact, this project, as large as it is, has sold virtually all of the energies pre-sold. They haven't even started operating, and they sold 400 megawatts of solar electricity to Amazon. And it's probably part of the reason that Amazon is locating, and I forget the numbers, but I think it was $3 billion, their new cloud computing center that they're actually building down in your neck of the woods in southern Alberta, because they could procure all of this cheap renewable energy here in Alberta. And it's one of their missions at Amazon to operate on renewable electricity like Apple and a whole bunch of other large companies. So it's a pretty good news story, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. Solar in Alberta right now, the thing that really gets me jazzed about solar, wind power is very different. So not only because it runs on wind instead of sunshine, although I guess they all run on sunshine at the root directory, or fusion power if you like, because that's how the sun produces all its energy. But wind power only works at big scale. Yeah, small wind turbines work, but you can't predict how they work. And so wind is basically a very big business. You have to go big, you have to build lots of wind turbines, they're very expensive. Solar, on the other hand, works on your garage. It works, you can buy a solar panel at Canadian Tire to run a trickle pump that pumps your water into a tank if you're on a farm. Or you can buy 10 kilowatts and put it on your house. It's economic today. It'll probably pay back in 10 years. Or you can build utility scale like you see. That's why solar is such a big deal, because it affects just about every other sector we want to talk about. And the really exciting thing is solar is changing the whole profile of the electricity industry, in that it's democratizing it in a very serious way. You know, 20 years ago, we would have had 12 electricity producers in Alberta, somewhere in that neighborhood. Today, we have over 8,000 electricity producers. Almost all of those are solar, ranging from some of you who might have solar on your home to Dan Balaban and Traverse Power, or the Traverse project in Greengate Power. That's pretty interesting, and it's going to change the power dynamic of how that industry operates over the long run, because that's a growing constituency. And that's something to think about, because they are going to have an impact on how this all works in the long run. We may see some wars between the big guys and the little guys, and all the different kinds of energy in the meantime, but in the end, it's going to be a very distributed industry, which I think is very healthy and very good. Solar, there's a lot of myths, and I'll touch on a few today. One of the myths about solar, and I hear this all the time, of many, by the way, but one of the ones I hear all the time is that, oh my God, why are we taking up all that amazing farmland with solar? And that's a good question. That's a very good question. And so when I went to the Claresholm project, when I did my original story, it was in the wintertime, so I didn't get to fly my drone because the wind was howling and it was crappy weather. But last summer, my wife and I were camping down in southern Alberta, and I said, well, let's just stop by Claresholm and see what see how the wind farm's going. It's operating now. So I stopped by there, and lo and behold, I met this guy, and I'm trying to remember his name right now, and I can't. But anyways, he's leaning against the fence there. He's a Hutterite fellow. And I walked up to him. I said, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm watering the sheep. I said, sheep? Oh, I didn't know there was sheep. And he said, yeah, we run our sheep here just like we used to run before the solar farm was built. So the Claresholm project was built on 1,000 acres of farmland in southern Alberta, but most of it's very marginal farmland. And in fact, most of it was grazed prior to building the solar project. The only difference is the reason the Hutterites got the contract, by the way, is they own a lot of land, and the solar owner could have a contract with one landowner for all the land they need for their solar project, which is less messy than having lots of landowners, which is more complicated. And so it's a simple business reason why they partnered with the Hutterites in this case. And the Hutterites benefited tremendously. So Hutterites are very industrious folks. They actually took about $1 million worth of contracts for construction of the solar project on their land, hauling gravel, helping out in whatever way they could to build the project. Now they get lease payments for the life of the solar project, 20 or 25 years. And they have this industrial scale fence around their farmland that's maintained by a solar company that keeps their sheep in. And as it turns out, they build these solar farms with in sections. So there's about 400-acre sections that they can rotate their sheep. So they put their sheep in one section for a month, then they move them to another section. And I have to tell you, a bit of a climate change angle here is when I was there during the heat dome last summer, I can tell you where all the sheep were. Under the solar modules, because it was hot. And in fact, the only place the grass was growing last summer, ironically, was under the solar modules because it was too hot and dry in much of southern Alberta last year. So pretty interesting story. This is how it should be done. I'm not sure they're all being done this way, but there you go. I'm not going to talk about that slide. Another really interesting project that I love comes from Taber, Alberta, and a fellow by the name of Keith Hershey, who's a farmer down there. His dad was a farmer. Both he and his dad worked for the oil industry part-time. Keith wound up working full-time for the oil industry eventually. And then he got to thinking about, what do we do with these 170,000 orphan wells in Alberta? And he came up with this idea of replacing the orphan wells once they're done with mini solar farms. Turns out you can fit about 1 megawatt of solar on an oil pad. You've already got a road in, you've got an electricity connection, it's all good. If the wells are orphan wells, then the municipality's not getting taxes from the oil lease anymore, the landowner's not getting payments for the lease payments. You replace it with solar, they get new lease payments, the county gets taxes. It's like a model of energy transition because it's not like it's competing with oil and gas. It's just reusing the sites that are already there. This is an amazing project. Keith has done some research and he said, if we just covered 10% of these old lease sites with solar, it would produce 6,200 megawatts, which is really, really significant. That's like Traverse times about 15, and Traverse is very big. So pretty cool idea, a very good energy transition idea, and something that will help make landowners very happy. And by the way, these small projects are the perfect scale for either farmer cooperatives to own, local municipalities, or irrigation districts. So the 2 pilots being built right now in southern Alberta are actually owned by the irrigation district, which, guess what? They need power about midday and perfectly timed with the sun, number one. Number two, it helps reduce their peak energy use, which actually reduces all their other energy costs as well, because it reduces the cost of their energy that they have to purchase in addition to the solar energy that they produce themselves. So solar also plays a role in helping us with our buildings and with other sectors as well. This home on the left was built by a production builder in Alberta, not just a tiny builder, but Landmark, who builds about 1,000 homes a year in Calgary and Edmonton. This home was 6 or 7 years ago now. This was a net zero solar powered home that included a garage for $399,000. So this is a home, you buy it, your utilities are paid for basically for the life of the home, no gas connection, no gas bill. You only have an electricity bill, and on a net annual basis, it will get all of its energy from solar. This is another interesting story from Edmonton. Edmonton took its airport lands. We had an airport in the middle of the city, very contentious. It was repurposed. Our ex-mayor decided that he needed something dramatic. So Stephen Mandel came up with the idea of doing sort of an eco-friendly neighborhood. Well, it turns out the old airport lands, which are almost right downtown in Edmonton, there's enough room there for 30,000 homes. And what the city did is they acted as developer and imposed their own building code. And so there's a green building code for there. And so their goal is to become a carbon neutral community. So in my work, anywhere, this is the largest planned carbon neutral community that I'm aware of, certainly in North America, maybe in the world. It's now under construction. These units here are actually under construction in front of you. That's my unit right there with the circle around it. And these neighborhoods, this neighborhood is actually going to get its heat from geothermal energy. So there's a district energy geothermal loop that runs under the lake and feeds warm fluids into all the homes that'll use heat pumps to heat the homes that are powered by electricity from the solar. And so on a net annual basis, these homes that you see in the picture will be net zero. Lots of companies getting involved in this. I had the pleasure of meeting Peter Robinson, who's the fifth generation leader of Simons. You guys know Simons? No? Okay, good, because I didn't either. When I was offered the chance to do the interview, my daughter was horrified. She said, "What, Dad, you don't know Simons?" And I thought, okay, what is Simon? So she took me on a tour to West Edmonton Mall, and I found out it's a place you can buy $600 runners if you want, you know, with some basketball store's name on them. But that's not why I'm telling you this story. Simons is the oldest retailer in Canada, I guess after the Hudson's Bay Company. They began operating as a small general store in Quebec City before Canada was a country. They now have. Edmonton was actually the first place outside of Quebec to get a store, and that was at West Edmonton Mall. And then Edmonton was the first place to get a second Simons store in Londonderry Mall a number of years ago. And I was there to do a story on the fact that they had decided they were going to try to get as much of their electricity from solar as possible. So they covered their end of the mall with solar, and the Simons at Londonderry runs on about 50% solar energy. But before he was done the interview, Peter Robinson told me that he was already under construction and building the first net zero solar powered department store in all of Canada. It's actually in Quebec, and it's geothermal heated and solar powered for lights, heat, everything. Pretty amazing. And it proves you can do this at scale and economically as well. I told you about the Landmark guys that are building net zero homes, which is really important. If anything, Landmark and some of the other builders in Alberta were way ahead of the curve, and the market didn't really understand the value proposition of building these net zero homes, which is now coming around. It's now coming full circle finally. So when I started doing stories in this area, I would do stories on companies from Ontario that really didn't know how to build these things as well as the Alberta builders, but they've now gone past us. So this is TerraView Homes, which contacted me and asked me to do a story on them. They're an old family business that has been building for 30 or 40 years in Guelph, Ontario, and they're only building net zero. So here's a regular builder developer that's only building net zero homes. And now they're building net zero multifamilies. You can see in the picture there. At the time I did the story, and this was a number of years ago, they had built 50 net zero and had sold 70 more net zero homes. So obviously the market is coming around and the builders are coming around. They were resisting this in the beginning. They now realize this is the future. I want to tell you another way that solar can be used and how it combines with geothermal again and really works towards building a resilient future. This is one of the most inspiring stories I've found in Canada of an application to institutions. So this is the Westmount Presbyterian Church in Edmonton. It's an old church. It was an old church, sort of a cinder block church, super leaky, had 7 furnaces. They all had space heaters under their desks, and they couldn't afford to fix it. So They were out of money. They had a shrinking congregation, aging congregation. They had all the problems that many churches are facing these days. And then they sat down and they assessed their assets. And they said, well, what do we have as assets? Well, we have our commitment and our passion for doing good in the world. And the second thing we have is we own a whole block of land in Westmount, a very old and valuable area in Edmonton now. And so with no money and a shrinking congregation, they did a very creative thing. They partnered with an organization called Right at Home Housing, which builds social housing in Edmonton, which actually is able to raise money to build things, but very hard for them to find places as good as this to build social housing. So they gave them a 50-year free lease, and Right at Home raised the money and built a net zero housing complex and a new net zero church. And so the church congregation has been totally reinvigorated because they have such a nice new church. Their utility bills are low. They're on the mend again. They're growing again. And you have a social housing project. So what I love about this project is that these solutions are making these things better. So I often hear, well, how do you want to do incentive programs for solar. Well, how do you help poor people? Well, poor people aren't going to buy solar, obviously, because they probably don't even own their own home. They're renting a home. But you don't try to address them there. You meet them where they're at. So for example, this social housing agency, yes, they can raise money to build things, but they have a lot of trouble coming up with enough money to operate things, because nobody wants to donate money to operate buildings for social housing or otherwise. It's just not a sexy thing to donate money to. So what they did was they installed a geothermal system that heats all 15 or 16 units and the church. So they have their own utility, no gas hookup. They would have had 16 gas hookups on this site at $50 a month just for the fixed charges. That's all gone. So it's all heated by geothermal. Essentially, they own their own utility, and it's all powered by solar energy, which makes both the social housing agency and the church much more economically resilient, not just climate resilient, over the long run. And you can take this same thinking and apply it to schools, institutions, nonprofits, a whole bunch of different types of organizations. And in fact, I did. So I volunteer in my own community. This is Evansdale Community League in North Edmonton. We run hockey program, or used to run hockey programs. We run programs. We have a skating rink, pickleball courts, and all that kind of stuff. We run Taekwondo programs and Zumba programs, stuff like that. And we were trying to figure out what to do with our hall. And so we added 26 kilowatts of solar. We did an energy efficiency upgrade. And as of the last 2 years, our electricity bills are actually positive at the end of the year. So our solar covers all our fixed, administrative, and all the other, and the energy costs, and then actually present us with a little bit of cash each year. So our electricity costs zero. And since we raised all the money to do this, we've already been in the money for years since we put the solar system in. So again, a very resilient, smart thing to do for organizations. What do we do with the money saved? Well, we're a community organization. We do crazy things like help kids and run programs with the money that we save. I just wanted to touch on this as well. This is something you don't hear enough about, in my opinion. You hear about the big solutions, carbon capture and storage. You hear about energy storage. You hear about a lot of the big solutions, but you don't hear enough, in my humble opinion, and I think it's because it's not well understood yet, about smart solutions, about IT solutions, about AI. This is a guy, very clever guy, from a company called DC, as in direct current, DC Bell, out of Montreal, who created this new device. And we're all going to need vehicle chargers eventually in our garage, and we're going to put at least level 2 chargers, because plugging into the wall is just not going to cut it over the long run. And what this guy did was he said, well, why don't I just combine the thing you need and have a one-stop device that'll serve all of our new homes under this whole new energy paradigm. And so this device is a DC vehicle charger. It's very fast. It's like twice as fast as a typical level 2 charger. It can charge 2 vehicles at once. It's also a solar inverter. So you buy this one device. You don't need to buy a solar inverter to install solar. It's a solar inverter. It's also an AI-powered smart energy device that will, depending on how you program it, will be able to manage where your energy goes. And in fact, it could take energy back to your house from a car. From your car in a blackout or whatever else happens. And eventually our grid is going to transform from dumb policies and dumb regulations to smart regulations that'll work with these technologies. And you will have your device, you won't have to worry about this. Your device will know when electricity is expensive. You'll actually be able to help the grid with your home energy device, and you will probably be compensated for that as a service at some point. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. And one more myth, people recycling solar, hear about it all the time. There are some companies starting up in Canada, but they're very early stage. So I found this company called FabTech out of Phoenix, Arizona. And they're up and running. And so they have a thriving solar recycling operation already. And they approach it two ways. One I hadn't thought of. So they do one of two things with solar modules. If they're still good, they repurpose them and sell them. And if they need recycling, they recycle them. They are not good at recycling, so they partnered with a glass company out of Oregon that has actually figured out how to recycle solar modules very efficiently. And so they do the recycling, whereas FabTech gathers up, because solar is improving so fast, it's not just solar getting old. Some solar farms are being retired early and they're replacing the solar modules because they're just so much more efficient, the new modules. And so they actually repurpose those and have created a whole new market in used solar modules, which allows people who couldn't afford solar to buy solar. And it's thriving. And so they're very high recycling rates for the materials. And so it can be done, it will be done. And we'll see companies like this starting up in Canada, I'm sure. So the other thing I hear about is electric vehicles. What about those nasty batteries? And it's true, batteries are not the friendliest thing to the environment. But lithium ion are nowhere near as bad as NiCad batteries or the old lead acid batteries. This is a company out of Ontario, Kingston, Ontario, called Li-Cycle, L-I-Cycle, and they have figured out how to recycle lithium-ion batteries. And in fact, they're so confident in the technology that they've developed to do this. They've already built a massive plant in Rochester, New York, and another one in Kingston, Ontario. They're able to recycle 95% of the components of a lithium-ion battery, and they actually expect a very thriving, growing market because we're expecting shortages for periods of time in some of the minerals and whatever else you need to build cobalt, that kind of stuff, to build lithium-ion batteries. And so they can actually take this material and make it as good as virgin lithium and sell it right back to the companies that make the batteries. And so this company is doing very well, and they're almost past the startup phase. They're operating in New York and Ontario. So I just wanted to touch on the connection. There's a really powerful connection between solar and electric vehicles. And sometimes EVs beget solar and sometimes solar begets EVs, and I'll explain why that happens. This is Carol Bishop, very average person with an average job. She's a friend of mine, by the way. She'd be okay with me saying that. She's a graphic artist, doesn't make piles of money. So she spent an extra $5,000 or $6,000 or $7,000 or $8,000 on a car out of commitment. She wanted to have an electric car. She loved the idea of an electric car. So she bought a Nissan Leaf, which is a short range electric car, as a second vehicle for her family, and loves it. And there's a really good reason why she loves it. She keeps track of her mileage and stuff. This is an app I think that Nissan provided her with. And when I was there in 2019, she had just run 600 kilometers in 1 month for $9 worth of electricity. So, when you're thinking about gas at $1.80 or whatever the heck it is today, that's pretty sweet. 600 kilometers for $9. Now you'd have to add the grid fees to that. So maybe it was $14 or something like that, but still pretty darn good. In her case, buying an EV inspired her. She wanted to have clean energy for EV in her home, so she installed solar. So her family installed a pretty large solar system. I think it was about 10 kilowatts on the roof of their home. And you find this link all the time. I used to have a stat that 30% of EV owners wind up installing solar. It's probably higher now, but regardless, there's a really strong connection. And here's sort of an exploratory piece on why that happens. This is Ron Kube. He's a professor of robotics. He had a house where he saw his neighbor put solar on, and he said, well, I want to have solar. I think that's really cool. And he didn't really know anything about it. So he called the solar company. Solar company came out and said, how much electricity you use? He goes, I don't know. Never really thought about it. So he gathered up his bills. And with a very regular home, I think it was a 2,000 square foot home or 1,700 square feet, like a very average home, he found out he was using 12,000 kilowatt hours of electricity a year, which is 50% more than average, and had no clue why. So being a professorly type and a fan of spreadsheets, he bought a bunch of meters and plugged in every single device in his house and tracked all the data for his clothes washers and his toasters and coffee makers and oven and freezer and fridges. And he made a giant spreadsheet and found out where he's using his electricity. Well, in his case, he just hadn't been paying attention. You know, the LED revolution came and went, and he had missed the whole thing. He had 800 watts of light in his dining room, and his dining room was where the kids sat to do their homework. So they had 800 watts of light on from one light switch. In total, he had 5,000 watts of lights in his house because he hadn't switched from incandescents. So he did about $200 worth of changes and slashed his energy use. He unplugged a beer fridge, replaced the lights, put some power bars on some of his electronics equipment, really knocked back his electricity. I think it was all the way down to, it was about 8 or 9 kilowatts or something, or 8,000. And then he bought a 9 kilowatt solar system. But he was so in tune with the energy efficiency stuff, he kept going. And, you know, he found other ways of making his home more efficient. And he wound up figuring, I've got 3.5 kilowatts of extra electricity now. What do I do with that? Well, if you sell it back to the grid, everybody has this romantic vision of selling electricity to the grid. You don't make a lot of money, frankly. You know, he figured he'd make $300 if he sold the electricity to the grid. But then he ran a new spreadsheet and found out that if they bought a Leaf, that's his wife there with the Leaf, they could drive 22,000 kilometers, or they can make $300 selling the electricity. So they opted to buy the Leaf. And for 2 years running with impeccably kept spreadsheets, he actually tracked the price of gas at the Shell station down at the corner from his house weekly. And then he calculated after 2 years, he'd saved about $2,500 a year just on gas alone for their vehicle. So there's a big connection. When you start to integrate all these solutions, it actually gets better as time going on. So I'm going to wrap up pretty quick because I was hoping we could have a bit of a conversation. I hope I've left time for that conversation. How do you do this stuff? How do you get more people to put solar? You know, in my humble opinion, the biggest thing we can do is get solar into as many neighborhoods as we can, because in almost every single example I have seen, it was a neighbor or a story they read about another neighbor who had either bought an EV or put solar in that inspires us. We're social creatures. That's what moves us. And so that's kind of how it works. Well, how do we get people to renovate their homes? You know, like to take a home to net zero, it might cost you $100,000 or $80,000. Well, there is an answer to this. And a pilot program just started, sadly not in Calgary, but in Rocky Mountain House, and Devon and Edmonton have just started programs. It's called CEAP, which is kind of silly because the actual idea is called PACE. It's kind of an imitation of a PACE program, which is property accessed clean energy financing, which means you can get a loan against your house instead of against you. So you're not taking a loan out to buy a solar system. Your home is taking a loan out to buy a solar system. The repayment plan is calculated totally in concert with the payback of the device. So if you're putting solar on, it's got a 12-year payback. You would pay it off over 12 years. So you would not be out any cash from day one. You would just take the benefits and they would go into the payments. And at the end of 12 years, you would have solar and free electricity for the next 12 years after that, since solar's guaranteed for about 25 years. So it's called the CEIP, Clean Energy Improvement Program. These are loans you can get. This is going to be really big. And these are just pilot programs. I think we need like at least provincial scale, maybe even national scale, because we can all do this. You know, if we did this right, and if it was run by agencies that we trusted, we would all do this. Why wouldn't we? You know, if you could save money tomorrow and slash your emissions, whether it's your heating systems, your home insulation, or your solar system. So this is very important. We need to ensure that these initial programs are blown out of the water by people subscribing to them so that we can justify actually doing it right, which is on a much more massive scale. And a massive scale, for example, I was just going to end with this one thing. I don't know if you've heard of the concept of energy sprong, but again, going back to all those buildings that are already built and built inefficiently, the Netherlands has tackled this with gusto. So they have come up with this idea of industrializing the process and putting the financing that I just talked about and the industrialization of retrofitting homes to net zero all under one roof. And they've made it a national program, a national initiative in the Netherlands. And their goal is to retrofit every single one of 2 million buildings. It's already, you know, it's a national priority in the Netherlands, which means they're going to make every home in the country or every building more efficient. And the industrialization part of this is they're using a process called panelization. So they laser scan the building, and then they build new walls, new roof in a factory, and then they just drop it in with cranes, and literally within a week, they can reskin and re-roof a building and take it all the way from leaky cinder block to net zero, like virtually overnight. And in their case, with much higher energy costs in Europe, it completely pays for itself there out of the energy costs. And so they've done about 15,000 homes in the Netherlands. And this idea is now starting to at least show up in pilot form in other places around the world. And in fact, in Edmonton, Alberta, there's a guy by the name of Peter Amarangan, who's one of the most amazing net zero home builders in all of Canada. He actually built that church and social housing project that I showed you earlier. He's doing a pilot project in Edmonton. He's renovating, he's at the Sundance Housing Co-op, and they're renovating 59 units all at once, all the way to net zero, using this energy sprung idea of building whole new facades for the building. So it's a pilot, they're trying to figure it out. You know, I think by industrializing the process, making it more efficient, by combining it with financing over time, that's how you make this stuff work. I'm not going to talk about that one. I just want to end with this slide. I love doing this when I do it with students, and that is, you know, the largest protest in Canadian history wasn't over Quebec's separation or pipelines or truckers blocking roads. It was, in fact, a 15 or 17-year-old or whatever she was when she came to Montreal. 500,000 people took to the streets of Montreal when Greta Thunberg was in Montreal. It's the largest protest in Canadian history. She actually did come to Edmonton. I didn't get to see her because she's about 4'9" or something, and they didn't think to bring a podium. So she's somewhere, I don't know, she's somewhere there in that picture up near the front. But even 74% of people in Edmonton support climate action. And that was the largest protest I've ever seen in Edmonton. It spilled out of the legislature grounds all the way into downtown. It was one of the largest protests I've ever seen, even in Edmonton, which is kind of interesting. So, you know, very inspiring young lady. She found a way to get us, to bug us, to inspire us, to whatever it is that she does. She's done better than anyone I've ever seen before. So I think that's pretty cool. So I was hoping we had time for a little bit of discussion, and I'll defer to our organizers.
Well, thank you very much, David, for your uplifting presentation. We'll allow 10 minutes for discussions. So if you want to ask David a question or make a comment, if you can go to the bottom of your screen, if you're on a computer, on the right-hand side at the bottom, there should be a button which says reactions. You press the button reactions and it says raise hand, which is what I've just done. And I will ask you to unmute yourself and turn your video on and ask your question. And then at the end, after that, I'll go back the same thing and lower your hand so that I don't know. So we don't have people just leaving their hands up. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. I know I've got lots of questions. So let's get started. First, a hand up is Janet. Janet, please ask your question.
Yes, hello, David. I did put my question in the chat to you, but I'm curious. You made the comment that getting our energy grid off of natural gas is not a big task, but I wonder if you could comment on why our government then only sees that we would have our energy grid at 30% renewable by 2030. That seems quite pitiful to me. Can you speak?
You're right, it is. But I have to say, at the time that commitment was made, it was amazing. Because we hadn't done anything yet. I think that was the NDP government that made that commitment, and they did all those renewable projects, and that's what kind of started us down this road. So here's that graph that I didn't talk about in the talk, and you've asked exactly the big question. So this is right out of Capital Power's annual report when they reported to shareholders this year. It's not their graph, kind of clever, don't you think? So they're not saying they're committed to this, but there are clues in here as to what is going to happen. Yes, when I look at all that natural gas, I get concerned. You know, I think, oh my gosh, are we going to CCS all that? Or are we going to do more renewables? What are we going to do? Well, I think there's a clue right here inside a former coal company's presentation. So if you look at this graph, which they presented when they were talking about how energy is going to evolve in their annual presentation, which was in January, this is a US Department of Energy graph about, and they're kind of projecting how things will go in the US. So it's not perfect for us. But if you look at 2023, that's when we're finished, coal's done, and our gas has gone up, kind of like the graph shows, sort of like the graph shows. And we appear to have installed a lot of gas. We haven't really, we've just renovated a lot of coal plants. And so here's the interesting news about this. Number one, even Capital appears to be thinking that renewables are going to overtake gas. So if you look at that graph, that's what that says. And I predict they'll actually overtake gas in an even bigger way in the long run. And the other thing about gas is we're not locked in the long term for gas. A lot of these facilities that have been repurposed are now not new facilities, they're midlife facilities. And so that's a good news thing. That means we didn't just lock into gas forever. It means there's options coming in the not too distant future for some of them. And so I think they haven't figured it out. Capital Power, for example, is betting on CCS. Their new plants are hydrogen ready. They don't know how this is going to work. And I predict economics is on our side. CCS is going to be expensive. Hydrogen will only be used for what's really high value, and renewables are dirt cheap. So we start to sort out storage. We have better interties with BC and their massive dam storage. We use smart technologies. And I predict that, and this won't happen without some nudging, which I guess is your job, that we can use a lot more renewables, and we will, for simple economic reasons.
Okay, thank you. Rob, you're next up.
Hi, David. So about 8 to 10 years ago, I was working in the oil patch, and it was during a boom period. And I remember other business owners complaining about how the oil industry was basically sucking up the workforce, and it was so hard to keep people because they were all, abandoning their jobs and going off to work for oil and gas. And so I'm a little concerned right now with the way the world situation is, and the oil price is way up, and it's looking like we're heading into another boom. And I'm concerned that they're going to be, consuming that workforce that should be put towards renewable energy and retrofitting, so many different things that we need to be working on, and we need to work on it now. And it's like we can't afford to have what's happening right now. So do you care to comment on that?
Well, it is a dilemma. I think, I do take some solace in the fact that I'm not against oil and gas. Half my family works in oil and gas. Yeah. But I think the industry's already in their sunset mode. And so, yes, there might be some increased activity right now, but it's so cyclical. They're smart enough to know that it's risky as hell to go hog wild. And the oil and gas industry is already in a different mode already. And that mode is a sunset way of thinking. And so they know that rapid expansion is may or may not pay off. And there's no way to move that oil quickly anyways. There's no way we can move it quick enough to satisfy the big problems of today. And by the time we were able to satisfy those problems, they may not be problems. And so I think oil's doing everything it can right now, not to increase jobs, but to decrease jobs, because it's one of the ways they can make money. They're not making money by expanding. They're going to make money by spending less on labor, number one. And number two, they also have to pay shareholders more money as dividends than they used to have to, just to hang on to them, because it's not the shining light that it used to be, and it's not as appealing as it used to be. And so oil companies are much more cautious than they used to. Yes, we're going to need a lot of oil through even the most aggressive energy transitions. I'm not worried about the oil industry. But your point about jobs is still a good one, in the sense that how does a guy who is a heavy equipment operator for the oil sands making 6 figures transition to a solar installer job that might make 40 grand or 60 grand? Well, you're not going to do it until literally you fall out of your job as a heavy, in most cases. I can show you stories. I have interviews with people who have done that and have gone to NATE and studied alternative energy and have started solar businesses and other businesses. And there are smart oil companies. I just did a story not too long ago on a company called Tundra Process Solutions, one of the many, many, many oil service companies in Alberta that's been around for many years, that actually recently partnered with a company called Canadian Battery and started a new company called Eneon out of Calgary. Eneon standing for energy over the eons. And they started a battery company. These guys are growing 200% a year right now out of Calgary. They're installing microgrid systems in Waterton and Newbic, and grid systems in New York and Michigan. So some oil companies get it. And remember the economics I talked about off the top. Future investment. That's what's going to drive where these guys move. They're not going to try to fight uphill. And that's what oil is right now. It's kind of like fighting uphill. They know we need oil. So they're secure in some ways. But where's the future money going to go? And where are the future opportunities? And what are you going to tell your kid? Are they going to study geology right now? Or are they going to study alternative energy?
Thanks.
Okay, please lower your hand, Rob. Sandy.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, David, for a very inspiring presentation. I have a question about dash to gas. When we're moving away from coal and we're replacing coal with natural gas, I'm concerned about fugitive emissions. And I've heard some cases, some people are saying that, even gas sometimes can be just as bad or worse even than coal when you consider fugitive emissions. Can you comment on that, please? And thank you very much.
Thanks, Sandy, for the comments. It's something you should be worried about. It's not my area of expertise, but from what the reading that I've done it is a pretty big deal. And I do worry about gas. And, I really think a lot of those companies are still wishing and hoping. And I really hope that we don't publicly pay for CCS too much. We should provide incentives to do that, just like we would for electric vehicles, but we shouldn't invest too much in it, because honestly, I believe economics will sort this out in a favorable way in the long run. You should be concerned about fugitive emissions. That's my understanding about it. And I'm not sure, it's beyond my area of expertise, Sandy, frankly, so.
Okay, are there any other questions? I don't see any other hands up. If not, I'll just ask one question, David. And that is, it seems to me the low-hanging fruit to get things started is in avoiding energy use in the first place by increasing energy efficiency. In 2009, we renovated our house and we invested quite a lot in insulation and reduced our gas use by about 1/3 simply from insulation. How do you, I mean, that seems to me to be the starting point should surely be to reduce our demand rather than trying to replace our supply.
Yeah, and it's never talked about enough. Absolutely. And, you know, I did have the pleasure of heading up Energy Efficiency Alberta when it was running. And there's just so much potential there. And frankly, we won't be successful with climate change unless we do a lot of energy efficiency. And there's still a lot we can do. It's funny, I'm working on a story right now with a family in Edmonton that started 20 years ago. So when it wasn't even fashionable, they took their 1960s home and just wanted to add some insulation. And they were so slow and methodical at it and DIY that they actually wound up on a pathway where they did the insulation first. They actually took it, hand dug, him and his wife, down to the footing and put insulation all the way down this concrete walls in the basement. They did their roof. They added 18 inches in the ceiling. And they did this all themselves. And they didn't even realize that they were on a pathway to this future goal of something called net zero, because nobody even knew about it or talked about it at the time. Well, this fall, after they'd done all that, they'd already put solar on the roof of their house, which, by the way, they're absolutely delighted with. This fall, or last fall, after the heat dome, they're sitting in their new efficient home, sweating like the rest of us, you know, under 37 or 38 degrees or whatever the heck it was last summer, and said, well, we still got our 85% efficient furnace, which we do. And this guy, also a former oil and gas guy, by the way, did some research, and he said, well, heat pumps. And not only heat pumps, they went the whole 9 yards and they installed geothermal. So they put geothermal wells in their front yard and installed a geothermal system, which of course is very robust, better than air source heat pumps. And also heat pumps are pretty cool. They're about 400% efficient on heating and about 600 or 700% efficient on cooling. So now they have an air conditioner, good for the hot days, and they have a system that doesn't produce any emissions because it's solar powered, and they wound up doing exactly the right thing. So essentially $100,000 donation, but at a time, you know, over 20 years. And I asked them if it was good for their relationship. I said, you know, renovations of that scale can be pretty hard on relationships. And they said, no, you know, this has been our mission for the last 20 years. It's kind of brought us together. And now they're telling their story. They've made it their mission to actually tell the story about what they've done. And you know, there is something we need to guard against, and that's doing incremental upgrades that compromise your ability to go further. So if you just take your 89%, 85% efficient furnace and replace it with a 98% efficient furnace, well, you're locking in to an investment that limits your potential to improve things. You've just made a marginal improvement, but you're probably not going to buy a heat pump now. And you've locked into the use of natural gas. You can't get rid of the natural gas utility, which is another benefit. If you're going to go all the way, go all the way and benefit as much as possible. So yeah, you know, energy efficiency is a really big deal, and it plays into it's the hidden thing behind a lot of those boxes, frankly, that is going to go the mile for us in the long run.
Okay, well, thanks very much. And thank you for our questions. I'm now going to, if you can stop sharing your screen, please, David. I just will briefly share my screen because we're going to go into breakout rooms, and these are the breakout rooms we have. We have municipal engagement, we have green transmission and solar, coal policy, engaging seniors, and pensions and investments. Now I don't, so just bear that in mind because I'm going to stop sharing, and now I'm going to go to breakout rooms. I got some of you assigned already and some of you not. Veronica and Bruce, where would you like to be assigned?
I think I wanted to be on number three.
Number 3, that's coal policy?
Yes.
Okay, great. Jan, boy, yeah, I got Janville. Marlene Weens?
I'll go into number 2, please.
Number 2. That's green transition. Yeah, okay. Rob Chombley.
Present.
Rob is in one with Rob Miller.
Okay,
Mhm.
all right. Okay, that's where he is. Sandy Aberdeen.
Number 5, please.
Number 5. Okay. Pensions and investments. Okay. Marlene Weems.
Marlene said number 2.
Number 2. Okay. That's where she is. Okay. All right. I guess that's everybody. Okay. I will send you all to your rooms.